What if the war that reshaped the world could have been stopped before it even began? How did a global peace organization turn into history's biggest diplomatic failure? And how did its collapse clear the path for Hitler, Mussolini, and unstoppable destruction? In the ashes of the First World War, humanity stood face to face with its own brutality. Entire cities were wiped out, millions of lives were gone, and the world swore that such a catastrophe must never happen again. From that desperate hope was born the League of Nations, an institution that promised peace, cooperation, and a future where diplomacy would triumph over bloodshed. It was hailed as the greatest experiment in global unity the modern world had ever seen. But beneath its inspiring promises, a fatal weakness was already spreading. A weakness so deep that it would make the League not a savior, but a silent witness to the rise of future tyrants. This is the story of how the world's first international peace organization became a symbol of global failure, and how that failure opened the gates to the most devastating conflict in human history. The world had just survived the deadliest conflict it had ever witnessed. Nations were exhausted, families shattered, cities turned to dust. And in that moment of global heartbreak, people truly believed that humanity had learned its lesson. So when a new organization rose from the ruins, promising to guide the world away from war, many saw it as the final, fragile hope for peace. But behind the inspiring speeches and grand promises, a quiet truth lingered. The system meant to protect peace was weaker than anyone dared to admit. Picture the wreckage of Europe in the early 1920s. Smoke rising from broken buildings, children walking through silent streets, veterans returning home with haunted eyes. Against this backdrop, the world gathers in Geneva to build something extraordinary. Delegates arrive as symbols of unity, shaking hands, posing for photographs, declaring that war will never again decide the fate of nations. Their confidence fills the air like a bright dawn breaking over a dark night. But just beneath that glow, the cracks already exist. The new organization has no army, no enforcement, no binding power. It relies not on strength, but on goodwill, the same goodwill that had already failed to prevent the Great War. Countries join voluntarily, leave casually, and obey its decisions only when it suits them. Yet the world, desperate for hope, convinces itself that it's enough. Some key players are missing from the start. The United States, whose own president envisioned this entire project, never joins. Germany, branded the aggressor of the last war, enters late. The Soviet Union arrives even later. And this absence, this incomplete circle of nations, becomes the first whisper that something is fundamentally wrong. As the years pass, that early optimism begins to fade. Behind closed doors, diplomats exchange uneasy glances. They know the truth. The organization created to secure peace cannot stop even the smallest threat without unanimous agreement. If just one nation disagrees, the entire system collapses. And in an age filled with suspicion, resentment, and a desire for revenge, disagreement becomes the norm. The world is still trembling from economic disasters, political revolutions, and rising extremism. In this fragile landscape, the League of Nations stands like a thin wall, trying to hold back an approaching storm. Yet the world pretends not to see the fractures forming. Leaders speak proudly of cooperation, but behind their smiles lies fear of confronting aggressors, fear of taking responsibility, fear of repeating the horrors they just escaped. Soon, small violations appear. Borders are pushed. Treaties are tested. Nations watch carefully to see just how far they can go before someone stops them. The League meets. It debates. It delays. It releases statements. It urges peace. But words without consequences are only shadows, and the world begins to realize the truth. The system built to preserve peace cannot enforce it, and in that silence, In that hesitation, in that gentle refusal to confront danger head-on, the illusion of safety slowly begins to crumble. The world wanted peace so desperately that it placed its faith in an institution built on hope rather than strength, and that hope was already fading long before the storm truly began. Even as the illusion of security thinned, the world continued to move forward, unaware that every unpunished violation was teaching dangerous men a powerful lesson. Across continents, nations that once whispered in fear began to speak in bold, calculating tones. They had seen the hesitation, the delays, the endless debates. They had watched the peacekeepers stumble. And now, they understood. Opportunity favored the ruthless. We're now in the early 1930s, a world wobbling on unsteady legs. Economies have collapsed, unemployment lines stretch endlessly, and political desperation fuels the rise of radical voices. Crowds gather in the streets, shouting for solutions, for strength, for leaders who promise to restore national pride. In these chaos, new regimes rise not quietly, but with loud defiant ambition. Japan acts first. Its armies sweep into Manchuria with chilling efficiency, seizing land and resources in a sudden strike that shocks the world. Smoke drifts above Chinese villages. Soldiers march through conquered towns. Civilians run in fear. The organization responsible for peace condemns the invasion, calls for negotiations, and forms committees. But the aggressor does not flinch. Reports are written. Methinks speeches delivered, yet the Japanese soldiers remain exactly where they stand. This becomes the turning point. The world watches, holding its breath, waiting for the peacekeeper to show authority. But nothing changes. The invader simply walks out of the room, withdraws from the League entirely, and continues its conquest openly. That single gesture of departing delegate stepping out of the assembly echoes louder than any speech. It tells the world that power now belongs to those willing to take it. Others were watching. Others were learning. In Italy, Mussolini dreams of a new Roman Empire. Inspired by Japan's success, he seeks his own theater of domination. Soon, Ethiopian skies filled with the shadows of Italian aircraft. Gas masks appear on civilians. Villages burn, and desperate appeals for help pour into Geneva. The League reacts again. It condemns. It debates. It imposes sanctions. But the sanctions are weak, incomplete, designed to inconvenience rather than truly punish. Oil, the lifeblood of Italy's war machine, is left untouched. So Italy continues, undeterred. The world's faith diminishes further. Nations begin to wonder whether the League's promises were ever real, or simply comforting illusions meant to ease the pain of an earlier tragedy. Every failure becomes a lesson, every delay a signal, and every unchallenged act of aggression a step toward a darker future. The world is no longer drifting into danger, it is accelerating. As the 1920s had unfolded, the League of Nations stood proud on paper, yet powerless in practice. It had no army, no real authority, and no way to punish nations that defied its rules. And slowly, the cracks began to show. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the world waited for the League to act. It hesitated. It debated. And in the end, it did nothing that mattered. The message was clear. Powerful nations could break the rules without consequence. Others were watching. Italy saw it. Germany saw it. Dictators rising from the ruins of economic chaos saw that the League was not a shield, it was a shadow. And in that shadow, ambition grew bold. Sanctions came too late. Negotiations solved nothing. Agreements were violated again and again. Yet the League clung to hope instead of taking action. The world wasn't drifting toward war, it was marching straight into it. While the organization meant to stop it stood frozen, terrified of angering the very nations threatening peace. By the time Hitler began rearming Germany, remilitarized the Rhineland, and tore up the Treaty of Versailles piece by piece. The League had already lost all of its credibility. Its failure became the fuel for aggression, and its silence became the soundtrack of collapse. The world had built an institution to preserve peace, but had forgotten to give it power. And in that critical weakness lay the seed of the Second World War. This is not just the story of a failed institution. It is the story of how peace, when left unprotected, can be utterly destroyed by those who seek power at any cost. It's a chilling reminder that goodwill and good intentions are not enough to stop those determined to plunge the world into darkness. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most critical moments. As crises erupt across the globe, Germany watches, not with alarm, but with the keen eye of a strategist. It observes the world's hesitation, the deep-seated fear of conflict, and the desperate hope that peace can be maintained at any cost. It sees aggressors facing no real consequences for their actions, and in this shadow of global uncertainty, a new power begins to rise from the ashes of old humiliation. Treaties are violated, yet remain unenforced. Rearmament begins in secret, then flourishes in the open. Speeches grow sharper, crowds larger, and ambitions louder. All the while, the international peacekeeper, clinging to the belief that diplomacy alone can tame the tide, issues warnings without punishment. But each warning is ignored. Each violation grows bolder. The organization speaks of peace, while dictators speak of destiny. The contrast is stark, impossible to ignore. The world is transforming. Smaller nations lose their trust in collective security. Larger nations become cautious, then divided, then openly skeptical. Allies fail to act together. Some are paralyzed by fear of another war. Some see an opportunity for personal advantage. Others simply hope the storm gathering on the horizon will somehow pass them by. But storms don't just pass. They build. As rising powers discover that the guardians of peace have no teeth, they stop hiding their intentions. They stop fearing consequences. They stop pretending to respect the fragile system meant to restrain them. They move forward, driven by ambition and emboldened by the world's silence, confident that no one will dare to stop them. Soon, the world finds itself on a narrow bridge, precariously balanced between a fragile peace and an inevitable conflict. With every passing year, the footsteps of the rising powers grow heavier. What began as isolated acts of defiance has now become a pattern a peacekeeper cannot break, and one the aggressors can no longer resist. The momentum that once leaned toward stability now swings violently toward chaos, and no amount of diplomatic language can slow it down. We see Germany in the mid-1930s. Factories, silent for years, roar back to life, but they aren't making goods for civilian prosperity. They are forging weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Armies of workers file into massive steel plants as smoke towers rise over newly energized cities. The world sees this. Reports are written, envoys travel back and forth, and warnings are issued. But the peacekeeper's voice is just a whisper against the deafening sound of machinery building an army. Its words, once meant to inspire unity, now echo in a world growing deaf to the call for peace. Then, defiance becomes open. In a symbolic act that shatters Europe, Esse fragile balance German troops march into the Rhineland. This is a direct violation of the treaties that ended the last Great War, a bold challenge thrown at the feet of the international community. The soldiers cross the bridge, at first slowly, unsure if the world will react. But when they realize no one is coming to stop them, their pace quickens with confidence. Cameras capture the scene. Citizens cheering, flags waving, military bands playing triumphant anthems. Back in the assembly halls, the peacekeeper debates, compares documents, and searches for a compromise. But the moment has already passed. The aggressor has tested the system and discovered its fatal flaw. The guardians of peace are unwilling to enforce their own rules. The silence that follows is the final confirmation. The world's shield is hollow. From that moment on, everything accelerates. Austria is next, absorbed in a whirlwind of political pressure and military intimidation. Again, the world watches. Again, diplomacy stumbles, and again, the peacekeeper expresses its deep concern but takes no action. Every time the world fails to respond, it sends a clear signal to those hungry for dominance. The path is open. The way is clear. We then move to Munich, where leaders gather around polished tables, desperately hoping to resolve the crisis through negotiation. Their faces show a desperation disguised as confidence. They believe that by offering concessions, by sacrificing small nations to appease a growing empire, they can preserve the peace. But the concessions only fuel more demands. The crisis deepens, confidence fades, and the peacekeeper stands on the sidelines, unable to enforce its will, unable to prevent the unraveling of an entire continent. Meanwhile, Italy strengthens its alliance with Germany. Japan continues its brutal expansion across Asia. The world splits into blocks. Nations start choosing sides, not because they want to, but because they feel they must. Fear replaces diplomacy. Distrust replaces cooperation. And every nation begins to prepare for a conflict they all hope will never come, but now see as unavoidable. Inside the Grand Assembly Hall, where optimistic speeches once echoed, the atmosphere turns heavy. Delegates speak in lowered voices. Some avoid eye contact, while others privately admit that the very institution built to protect the world can no longer influence it. Documents pile up resolutions, condemnations, reports all just symbols of a system that has lost its authority. The great experiment in collective security is crumbling from within, its ideals overwhelmed by the harsh reality of unchecked aggression. Walking through dim archival halls, we pass photographs of smiling diplomats from an earlier time, men who truly believed they were shaping a peaceful future. That optimism stands in stark contrast to the grim footage now emerging from across the globe. Columns of tanks rolling across borders, swarms of aircraft darkening the skies, soldiers mobilizing, and alliances tightening. The world has shifted. It is no longer a question of asterisk. If asterisk conflict will erupt, but asterisk, when asterisk, the final blow comes when negotiations utterly fail, when promises made to protect smaller nations are proven to be empty, and when the aggressors decide that diplomacy is no longer necessary. They have learned, year after year, that the system meant to restrain them is powerless. They have grown stronger, bolder, and more unified in their ambitions. And so, the storm that had been gathering in whispers now breaks with thunder. Borders are crossed. Treaties are shattered. Europe plunges into a war even more devastating than the one that had inspired the dream of lasting peace in the first place. The organization meant to prevent this catastrophe becomes a mere spectator to history, a tragic reminder that peace, without the strength to defend it, is nothing more than a fragile hope waiting to be destroyed. The world had placed its trust in an institution built on the ideal of unity, but unity without action could not stop the rising tide of aggression. In the end, the tragedy of this era lies not only in the actions of the aggressors, but in the silence of those who believed peace could survive without protection. The world hoped that ideals alone could hold back ambition, that signatures on treaties could restrain regimes built on conquest, and that diplomacy could tame leaders who saw compromise as weakness. But hope, without resolve, became the very weakness they exploited. In the final frame, we see empty halls and abandoned documents, reflections of the collapse of an institution that once carried the dreams of millions. What was meant to be a shield for the world became a symbol of what happens when nations refuse to stand together. When it matters most, not because they wanted war, but because they feared the price of preventing it. And as the world descended into flames once more, a painful truth emerged. Peace demands more than just promises. It requires courage, unity, and the willingness to confront danger before it becomes unstoppable. The organization built to guard the future possessed none of these won its greatest test game, and so the storm swept across the globe, reshaping borders, rewriting history, and claiming millions of lives. Only later, in the ruins of that second catastrophe, would the world truly understand the cost of hesitation. Only then would it realize that peace is not preserved by avoiding conflict, but by standing firm against those who seek to destroy it. And so, the failure of the League of Nations became more than a historical event. It became a warning, carved into the memory of humanity. A warning of what happens when good intentions meet unchecked aggression, and when the dream of peace is left unguarded in a world still learning the consequences of its own silence. Thank you for watching.